Welcome. My name is Spencer Ruchti. I'm the author events manager at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. I am very excited to be discussing the Art of Libromancy with Josh Cook tonight of Porter Square Books on behalf of Third Place Books. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for watching. Feel free to put your name in the chat, say hello, let us know where you're calling in from. I see a lot of familiar names today. The Art of Libromancy is a very special book, of course, because it talks about our beloved practice of bookselling, and Josh has a lot to say on the subject. Josh has been at Porter Square Books for now 19 years, I believe, and counting. Quite a number of years. He's been at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts since 2004. Again, yeah, let us know where you're calling in from. We're going to have time for your questions during the last 15 minutes of this conversation. So please submit those to the Q&A window below at the bottom of your screen. Josh Cook is a bookseller and co-owner at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where I would often run into him when I was a bookseller at Harvard Bookstore, 2 T stops down the line. Josh is also the author of the critically acclaimed postmodern detective novel, An Exaggerated Murder, published by Melville House. And his fiction, criticism, and poetry have appeared in numerous publications, alongside fellow booksellers Danny Kane and Jeff Deutsch. Josh is often cited as one of our bookselling experts in this country. He's often reached out to when a quote is needed or an expertise is needed on our art. So Josh grew up in Lewiston, Maine, and lives now in Somerville, Massachusetts, where he is returning from a little hiatus from bookselling, from being in the bookstore. Josh, welcome. I wanted to talk just briefly, first of all, before we have you read a passage from the Art of Libromancy about your career. Every bookseller gets started somewhere. I got started at a Barnes & Noble cafe in the Prudential Center, where I worked for a hot 6 months, making lattes for people and not actually selling books, but they called me a bookseller. So that's how I got my first job as an actual bookseller. Like I said, you've been bookselling for nearly 20 years as part of your career, and I would love to hear how you got started and have you ever thought about leaving? No, just kidding.
Okay. I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was about 16. And when I went to college, I kind of did the writery things. I majored in English. I did all the creative writing workshops and everything. And when I came time to graduate, for a host of reasons, I decided I didn't want to just go right to an MFA. I wanted to get out of the academic world and see what could happen. I did AmeriCorps Vista for a couple of years, which is like a domestic Peace Corps, in order to kind of stay in Burlington, Vermont, where I went to school. And then kind of other family issues brought us to the Boston area. And it just kind of occurred to me that a bookstore would be a good place for a writer to work. I didn't really have any other career goals besides making the rent at that point. I was still an aspiring writer. And so I applied at a number of the area bookstores, many of which are now gone, which has happened. And then I just happened to live near where Porter Square Books was opening. And I saw a big, neighborhood bookstore coming soon sign in the window. And I just made sure to walk by every day until they put up their help wanted sign. They did. I applied. I was one of the first 3 people they hired who didn't come from the Concord bookshop, where most of them came from. That first kind of 6 months or so, I was part-time, working nights and weekends. And then the person who was doing their website needed to leave for better healthcare, which is an unfortunate too common occurrence. And at the time, I was the youngest person who seemed to be interested in full-time work. And so being under 30, they decided to ask me to take over running their website. And it kind of grew from there. I did that, and then social media started happening, and I said, hey, can I do this? And they said, I guess, sure, do whatever you want. And I did. And so that kind of went from there. and there are obviously, we all know about the finances. There are obviously times where I was like, is this the best idea? Is this the best thing to do, to stay with? And there was never a point where I had to leave, for financing or whatever. And then, as I was getting into my 30s, when other things would be, other considerations like being a homeowner and having a family were starting to kind of increase in urgency, the principal owners developed the co-ownership plan that allowed me to buy into the store as a co-owner and receive a portion of the profits therein. And so that kind of stabilized me for the long haul. And here we are today, with my bookselling career, able to drink, but not able to vote, but can't drink or buy or rent a car yet. So
Right. Yeah.
we've still got some ways to grow.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that, Josh. And now that we kind of know how this happened, I would love if you read a bit of the Art of Libromancy for us. And I'm going to post some links in the chat while you're doing that to direct people to, let them know where you can buy that book, of course, and also some recent interviews that you've done, one particularly in Esquire, which I really love. So, Josh, if you would take it away.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a very short passage because I want to spend most of time on this conversation. But whenever there's a book, there's a question: why did you write this? Books are hard work. And so why did you do this? So this is a passage from the original chapbook that was published independently 2 years before, called The Least We Can Do: White Supremacy, Free Speech, and Independent Bookstores. And this kind of gives the origin story for this book. So this is a couple passages from that essay. And it's in a section called Apology. When Sean Spicer was given prime billing at Book Expo America, and Milo Yiannopoulos tried to publish a book with Simon & Schuster, I churned out 40 pages of text about free speech, white supremacy, and independent bookstores over the following several months, returning to it now and then as a salve or outlet for my frustration. And then I just let it sit. I should have written something even earlier, after I had been in bookselling for 10 years and watched Republican and conservatives profiting in terms of money and power off the racist backlash to the Obama administration. Someone should have written something even earlier, as we watched the Bush administration's two endless wars institute torture as an official American practice and completely remake American society after the trauma of 9/11. Someone should have written something when Rush Limbaugh's first book was published, before the reactionary racism of right-wing talk shows became fully mainstream. Like so many white liberal Americans, I thought the gains made during the civil rights movement were secure, and that even if there was still a long way to go toward true social and racial justice, at least we weren't sliding back. It's embarrassing. Only the thinnest veils were thrown over the racism of the war on drugs, criminal justice reform, and welfare reform. Even after the Tea Party rose to power almost entirely through white grievance and racism stoked by Fox News. Even after the Republican Party formally embraced this radical version of themselves, I did not see a resurgent threat, and I did not see my complicity in that resurgence. Donald Trump was president, in part, because the media, publishers, bookstores, book reviewers, readers, and everyone with power and influence in books decided it was okay to sell books by Rush Limbaugh, Bill O'Reilly, Ann Coulter, Tucker Carlson, and all the other right-wing pundits and politicians, monetizing and legitimizing the white supremacist ideas they expressed and providing a platform for those ideas to reach more people. Donald Trump was president because we did not take responsibility for our own decisions. Donald Trump was president because we did nothing when con artists monetized white grievance, white fear, and the ideas of white supremacy. Most of us took some of that money. Some of us took a lot of that money. Donald Trump was president because the conservative movement over the last 30 years broke our political media's bullshit detector. Donald Trump was president because people like Newt Gingrich, Paul Ryan, Mike Pence, Ted Cruz, and, well, Donald Trump himself were taken seriously, as if they were honestly participating in American political discourse. Donald Trump was president because publishers and bookstores showed readers that we believed those people and ideas deserved to be taken seriously. Whatever we do going forward, we can no longer pretend that we are innocent. Donald Trump put children in cages. We can no longer act as though book sales do not have ethical and moral components. Donald Trump sabotaged the national response to COVID-19, killing hundreds of thousands of people. We cannot pretend that it does not matter who we help make money. A Confederate flag was waved in the Capitol building during a violent insurrection that killed 6 people. We cannot pretend that we don't have some responsibility over what ideas are discussed in public discourse. I apologize for waiting this long to take this small step within my industry. I apologize for not listening to what many, many people have tried to tell me and all of white America about the threat to our country. I apologize for prioritizing avoiding interpersonal conflict with friends, families, and colleagues over confronting a persistent and deadly threat. I don't know if what I've written here will make a big difference. I don't know if independent bookstores have enough power to make a big difference in the fight against white supremacy, other supremacist ideologies, and fascism in America. But we have some power. And if we don't fight, we can't win.
Thank you so much, Josh. I think that's a really good segue into one of my first questions here, which is, I don't think that you don't really have many public-facing booksellers who are recognized, at a national level, especially, let alone, not that you would many editors or publicists necessarily either, people who are kind of on the back end of the industry, but writers are often the star. You have, folks like Paul Yamazaki, who, is going to be honored at the National Book Award, but, I know, bless his heart. If you haven't read, there's a wonderful LA Times profile by John McMurdy, I think his name is, that really honors Paul's life and legacy, and it is spectacular. But even, you have Danny Kain, who has, a few years ago had a profile in the New Yorker as like, here's what a bookseller is, here's what they do. But, a lot of people, not to toot our own horns, but don't recognize that there is, booksellers, your local bookstore has an immense amount of influence in what takes place in a, literary sense in your community. Not just as entertainment, but as, getting books into schools, donating books often, sending authors to schools, getting authors, just in general, to come to your city on book tours. It's very likely that if an author, is visiting your town, it's because a bookstore has either requested that author or has agreed to, field the logistics of hosting that author. And as someone who works in author events, it's something that, I'm close to. But I guess, so my first question is, you start this book right away in your foreword your foreword titled "A Reader's Introduction to Bookselling," by framing the collection towards the reader. You go out of your way to emphasize, even though this is a book supposedly about bookselling, if you want to know, if you're interested in where your food comes from, how your eggs are harvested, you should also be interested in where your literature comes from. So I'm very curious, what were the challenges of taking this collection, many of the essays which were written before the publication of this book? What were the challenges of also framing those in a way for the general public?
I would probably say that was at its heart a gamble that people find things interesting roughly the same way I do.
Right.
And so I kind of both intentionally and just kind of as the natural course of writing these pieces focus very much on speaking to booksellers. And my hope was always that that readers who love books will just find that interesting. And so and one of the things that I think I learned, and something you see in some reading, kind of reading in general, is sometimes hyper focus does allow you to see much bigger things. And so, I was hoping it would fit in with readers who would just be interested in general and also kind of share that reading tactic of mine as well, where you kind of, by looking at something as closely as possible, you can reveal much broader things around it. And so that was really the gamble Biblioasis took, that readers would kind of go with me on that. And so
I should mention Biblioasis is historically very supportive of bookselling in general.
Yeah.
They are a bookstore themselves. They often, they very much cater to bookstores. They have these very intimate relationships with bookstores. In fact, one of my lifelong career goals is to get on one of the Biblioasis bookseller trading cards.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, Josh, you have a card, don't you?
I do. I was in the inaugural deck.
Yeah. Okay. Of course. No, that makes perfect sense.
Move,
Yeah,
move a couple hundred copies of Duck's Newburyport, and they'll
yeah.
do nice things for you. So the reader's introduction that you referenced, that was kind of, okay, if this is going to happen, I want people to be able to read it well. I want people who to have the tools they need to not just be interested in kind of a passive way, like, oh, that's cool that bookstores do this, but to be able to think about it and engage with it. And
Yeah.
so, the essays are still very, very bookseller focused. And my hope was that people would be interested and that a reader's introduction would give them the tools to be kind of interested in active and productive ways.
Yeah. Yeah, one of those essays that I particularly love that kind of works on both ends of the spectrum is you have a great essay on the Janine Cummins controversy from 2020 on the publication of American Dirt. I know Third Place Books, this was before my time working at the store, but Third Place Books January 2020 was one of the tour stops on that tour. And when that book, kind of imploded for booksellers, it was we have a wonderful bookseller, our marketing manager now and social media manager, Rosa Hernandez, who was kind of at the forefront, who went to our event manager at the time and said, like, I don't think we should be hosting this author for these reasons. But anyways, you do a really wonderful job of explaining this is why this is why the book, or the efforts to publicize the book were felt as if they're in bad faith, why the public reacted the way they did. I think you summarized what Christian Lorenzen wrote in the London Review of Books really well. And you take all those pieces and what that in retrospect, you're like, oh man, it feels even worse than we thought it was, but also it's very clear-eyed. So I was going to also mention, you gave, as I mentioned before, you gave this wonderful interview in Esquire, which kind of along the topic of, is the public interested in what booksellers do? Was a real, I was on vacation when this, about to head out on like a week-long hike when I got this text about the Esquire interview, and was so, I guess I shouldn't say surprised, but Esquire is interested in what booksellers are doing. The headline was "Booksellers are suddenly at the vanguard of the culture wars," and it's very true right now. And Josh, I was hoping you'd be able to talk a little bit about that. Would you call it an exciting time to be a bookseller?
I really would. I really would. I think, and I've said this in a couple of different ways in the collection, and I've said it in a couple of different ways in other interviews, but I think there is a real opportunity for abundance for booksellers now that just happens to also coincide with this, these pressures and these strifes and these kind of looming and actual catastrophes. The kind of sales pitch that independent bookstores have been using for the last 25-ish years, since the kind of the indies die off in the 90s and early aughts, and Amazon, and then followed up with the shop local movement, is that the human connections that bookstores offer you is like a value added. That's why you'll pay more, is that you get this personal service, you get these recommendations, you get this sense of community. And it's true, but it had a very transactional kind of context for it. It's a very capitalist context for that. And it was an important idea. One thing I think we learned from the pandemic is that those connections that happen between essential strangers aren't value added. They are vital. Anyone who wants to live a social, social life wants to have these connections. And I think a lot of the bookstores that are doing pretty well now post-pandemic did a good job of not just kind of saying this is a value added, but like being there for customers during the pandemic to give them what they needed. Like it's not food, but it's still a need.
Yeah.
And I think independent bookstores leaning into that kind of sense of we give you community as well.
Yeah.
Have the opportunity to go from this relatively small and super small in terms of like other retail aspects of retail, but significant cultural force into something larger. I think there's a chance for more bookstores. I think there's a chance for more bookstores to hire more booksellers. And I think there's a chance for bookstores to pay those booksellers more.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just going to happen. Like the COVID pandemic created this opportunity for us, created this opportunity for abundance, but we're going to actually have to do the work for it.
Yeah.
And that's going to be hard, but luckily it's the work we kind of have been doing. And I think for most of us who are doing the work, the most energizing aspect of our labor at our stores.
Yeah, you end the collection with an essay titled "This Is My Mask," which is your very deliberate account of what it meant to work during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in this genre of retail. A lot of retail workers will probably recognize a lot of the elements you write about, but then in addition to that, you had, it was kind of good to have a booksellers had a whisper network of store owners, store managers, frontline booksellers were all talking about, like, how are you approaching this problem, and how do you, a lot of booksellers doubled down on online sales that hadn't really processed online orders before. A lot of booksellers were doing store pickup. I was working at for about 6 or 8 months during the pandemic at Broadway Books, which is this wonderful store in Portland, across the river from Powell's. And my job there was essentially, I went from was essentially just to be the door boy.
Oh yeah.
I sat at the door, I opened the door, and you write about this as well, Josh. It's like being the greeter, but we weren't letting anyone in the store. So it was just like, how can I help you, helping you at the door. And trying to be, people learned all kinds of new social interactions that they didn't realize they had it in them. But in that essay, so you write that, you got through the pandemic, you were able to continue paying all of your employees. I think it's important to note Porter Square also has a unique model for management in which it's a co-ownership model, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that mean everyone at the store has co-ownership or possesses co-ownership, or
just the management group?
Just management.
And so it was primarily a succession solution.
Yeah.
So figuring out that, the owners, the principal owners bought the store when some of the founders were looking to retire. They were not booksellers. They were people who had enough money to buy a bookstore.
Right.
And one of the things that kind of, they always, not guilt, but they've always felt that maybe that the people who should have bought the bookstore were the people who made the bookstore valuable.
Yeah.
And so, they're not planning to retire anytime soon, but they wanted to solve that problem. And so in this way, the managers are, and so they, because it was both a succession and a retention strategy, it was really focused on ownership. We have developed, at least in theory, a profit sharing model for non-management staff. But that is still in its early stages. And I think the way things have worked out, I don't know if anyone qualifies for it yet as we have done it. So don't anyone go call David and say, tell me about your because there are still some things that I think have to be finalized or tested out. But
yeah, I was gonna say, I once worked at a store with profit sharing as a benefit. It was a unionized store as well.
Yeah.
And we saw it once. And it was the first time in maybe a decade we'd ever seen it. And it was a total fluke. It was we have no idea, we just had a good year. Congratulations, everyone. But I was going to say, so as part of this essay about, the COVID-19 pandemic, you write, you continue paying all of your employees, you did your darndest to keep your community happy and well-read. None of your colleagues caught COVID-19, as far as you were aware. But then you follow up and you say, and yet it didn't feel like a success. In some ways, it didn't even feel like survival. Perhaps it's because people are still catching and dying of COVID. Perhaps it's because most of the other booksellers I spent the most time with during the height of the pandemic have left. And perhaps it was because of the missed opportunities to use the crisis as a creative force to make significant change in how we live, work, and sell books. Which leads me to two questions, going off of what you were talking about earlier about these missed opportunities. But first of all, can you speak about what some of those missed opportunities from the pandemic are, both regarding just working in the book industry in general and in selling books?
Yeah. I think about those missed opportunities at a slightly bigger scale. I think in the essays I talk about, we could have put in bike lanes everywhere while no one was driving. We could have recognized, we could have made work from home easier. And like, why aren't there tax breaks now for your own home internet if you work from home? Like, we could have institutionalized things that were survival strategies that ended up having other benefits. We could have taken over some more car space and made some green space. And thinking specifically about book selling, one of the things that I still think about this today, maybe the opportunity hasn't passed, is with the kind of collapse of the supply chain, people got reused to the idea of things taking time to get to them. It's like, if you think about it, if you explain to someone in like 1945 or whatever that you could get nearly every book you want in 2.5 weeks, they would lose their goddamn minds. And we're like pissed off if it doesn't come in 3 days.
Yeah.
If it doesn't come the next day.
No, I remember the holiday season. It was magical because everyone and their mother had heard about supply chain issues on NPR and the New York Times. And so you didn't really have to explain a whole lot, even if it was just your mistake, like, oh, shoot, like we forgot to order this. We'd shrug and be like, supply chain issues. And they knew. They're like, oh yeah, I heard that on NPR. Yeah. I'm an informed consumer. It was great.
But I think, there's the difference between getting a book really fast and getting a book as fast as is humanly possible is huge. It is, workers, it has warehouse workers not collapsing from heat exhaustion. It's UPS drivers not collapsing from heat exhaustion. It is like reducing the carbon footprint of planes flying things around. It is and bookstores have led culturally and economically before. I think the shop local movement is an extremely successful cultural and economic movement led by booksellers. We could have, I think, continued that conversation and said, see, this isn't bad. You getting this book in a month actually isn't that bad.
Yeah.
Would it be fine to have a world that doesn't involve laborers dying, that doesn't involve the planet on fire? It just means you get your book in a month. Like, can we? And I think there's probably still space for that somewhere, but that sits with me as like the very specific kind of general bookstore thing that maybe we could have made happen.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a book emergency, as one of my former managers would tell me. And it's also like, I was gonna bring this up because I have a few books that I love about, like not just like about retail culture, not necessarily about book selling, but Secret Life of Groceries by Benjamin Lohr is like the thing that I've been telling like anyone who works in retail or anyone who is a consumer should very much read. But it's very much a reminder that like, the supermarket as a place where you can go, as a mecca where you can walk in and see you have access to everything. You can buy anything you want there is a miracle. I mean, it is miraculous that everything is available to us at any given time. All it takes is, a little bit of money and walking into a single place. But I think, and then the second part of my question pertaining to that, passage about COVID is, I also think you've identified one of the biggest threats to professional book selling, which is turnover. And turnover is caused by a lot of things, but many things which are really the root of the issue: pay, lack of healthcare, lack of hours, lack of confidence in one's workplace. But I think we both know bookstores like to maintain the illusion that their intellectual and moral pursuits elevate them beyond the realities of retail and labor. I have a phrase actually. It's on my notebook called "Books are product," and it's not meant to demagicify books, but in a way it is. Like, bookstores are retailers and they're filled with workers. Books are not your typical product, and require a lot of knowledge to sell and to get off the shelves. But we're just like the Ross next door or the knitting store across the street. It just requires a lot of, inventory just requires a lot of specialized knowledge across many different subjects. But we require our booksellers to read outside of work. We require social fluency of them that is far more nuanced than, say, like finding a wrench at your local hardware store. Though shout out to Ace employees. They're always some of the greatest people at customer service. They're very good at what they do. But it's like, but there is I don't think there's no longevity in labor that pays under 40K a year. And for some, that bar is much higher for cities like Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. And Adrian Westfeld in that Esquire interview asked you, what is the biggest challenge facing bookstores and booksellers? And I want to kind of sharpen that question a little bit and say, from bookseller to another, like, what is the biggest threat, do you think, to professional bookselling?
So, the challenge I have in this moment is not that I don't have an answer to that question, is that I've just been asked to write about an answer to that question.
Oh, really?
From someone else who you certainly know, as like one of those like publicity essay type things. Yeah. So I'll answer two ways. Yeah. The first way, and this is one of the most frustrating aspects about bookselling and kind of thinking about where it is and where it could be, is the same things that make living in America challenging, make bookselling challenging. And it's hard to, like, there are no silver bullets to like saving the economy or saving bookselling, but like universal healthcare that is not based on employer contributions to health insurance plans would do immense immediate good for the sustainability of bookselling. People wouldn't have to leave to get healthcare, as like I referenced earlier, had to happen, which worked out great for me, but it's still a bummer, for them. Two, all of the money that bookstores have to spend on health insurance could be rolled into wages. Yeah. And so there's this whole set of external pressures that are challenges for bookstores, because they're challenges for existence. And then those kind of funnel into that idea of turnover. And so in another essay I write, I really dive into this issue of turnover. It's called "The Future of Bookselling is Booksellers," which is a phrase I got from the bookshop at the end of the world. I'm sure it's been kicking around a lot of other places before, but that's just where I encountered it. And we have, as you mentioned, it is a specialized field. It is a specialized generalized field. We have to specifically know a shit ton of stuff about a lot of different things, whether we went to school for those things or not. And so keeping people with that institutional knowledge should be expensive. The problem isn't that it is expensive. The problem is that the capital isn't always there. And so I'll say two things about that, I think. One is kind of from the bookstore side of things. I truly believe that higher wages in some ways might be a solution to higher wages. That you can, by kind of making that investment as much as you can, that will return in higher sales and higher profits, because those skills will stay, because that institutional knowledge will stay. I think one of the examples I may have used is if like someone walks into the store and asks me 5 books that they need right now because it's December, I can probably find those 5 books without looking them up.
Right, without looking in.
And so I just walk there and find it. And so an interaction with someone who's newer in the store, doesn't have that institutional knowledge, that's potentially a half an hour, 50-minute, half an hour transaction, which is so expensive for the store in December.
Of asking for, trying to find the right edition. Yeah.
Exactly. But I'd take care of it in 3 minutes. And that is a massive benefit for the store in terms of sales and profitability. The kind of more kind of customer facing side, one of the biggest challenges I see and I think most this faces retail in this country in general, is that all of our profits happen in the fourth quarter. And so higher wages that are paid throughout the year can present real cash flow challenges to bookstores, even if ultimately they would be able to afford them. So if there's anybody here who is not a bookseller, who's like thinking to themselves, what's something I can do, and also I'm not made of money, do your holiday shopping not in December. Spread it out. If you can plan. If you know you're going to spend $100 in December, spend it in August. if we could just kind of somehow shift the pathology of like Christmas shopping so that it's spread out more, that would make things so much easier for bookstores to bear the risks and then the benefits of higher wages.
Excellent answers. Excellent answers. I'll just, for everyone who's watching, we're going to get started in like probably 10-15 minutes with audience Q&A. So remember to submit your questions to the Q&A window, or put them in the chat and I'll read them aloud, and we'll get to those. I would love to hear your questions for Josh. And I
would too.
Yeah, and Josh would also love to hear those questions. I do believe I promised people that at some point we would be a bunch of, we would just be two dudes on the screen talking about translated lit, and I think people would be very disappointed if we didn't. So let's get into that. You actually have a specific essay about translated literature and experimental works of literature called "How to Read Experimental Works of Literature in Translation and Other Works You Think Are Too Difficult." And it's kind of it's like a list of actually like very practical advice on for the any average reader about, hey, are you interested in this? Are you wondering why all your friends are reading Thomas Bernhard? Well, like if you think it's too hard for you, then absolutely, like this is how you can approach that. So your advice is headlined within the essay, and is compulsively readable. One piece of advice you give, for example, is just finish the book. You have introduced this idea of a reader's first draft. Books are meant to be reread. We often forget that because when you work in the book industry or publishing, you're often just kind of cycling through as much as you can get at any possible time. But some books you mentioned as part of this essay is Rodrigo Frazan's trilogy published by Open Letter, The Invented Part, The Dream Part, and Remembered Part. They're all wonderfully translated by Will Vanderheiden, and they are monsters, but so fun, just like some incredible books. You talked about one of my favorite writers of all time, the Norwegian Jan Fosse, whose newly translated Septology is translated by Damien Searles and published by Transit Books. Let's see, you have Fernando Pessoa, Ariane Harwitz, whose Die My Love, translated by Caroline Orloff and Sarah Moses, is actually being made into a film starring Jennifer Lawrence.
Jennifer Lawrence.
Yeah,
I know, I saw that.
Will tell you translated literature does not sell. Just ask Jennifer Lawrence. So I really hope good things for Charco that takes off, because sometimes those book sales don't translate. But so there's a lot of essay or a lot of advice and a lot of recommendations thrown in here. So I wanted to back up a little bit and start off by asking, like, what was the book or maybe several books that propelled your interest into translated literature?
That's a good question.
It might have been a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a pretty long time ago. Part of my kind of entrance into so there's another essay I wrote in the collection about how I kind of came to see myself as an advocate.
Yeah.
And part of my kind of course into translated literature and the way I read it now and how important it's become to me is kind of seeing that as a gap at Porter Square and say, okay, this is where I can do some work. This is where I can move the needle a little bit. I'm trying to think. I feel like Ghosts by Cesar Ira might have been one of the early works that I really pushed and like hand sold and really focused on. Valerio Luiselli's Faces in the Crowd, which is a part of that essay, which I encountered in as a part of an Indies Introduced panel. That was hugely.
Mm-hmm. One of my first memories actually of seeing you like live in person in the flesh, because I think before that, like I just knew you from online, from Twitter, was Valerie Luiselli came and spoke at the Coolidge Corner Theater.
Oh yeah,
Brookline Booksmith, and you were there. I remember, Pierce, who was watching this, may have been there at the time the series was being run by Shuchi Saraswat, who wonderful bookseller who now works at
Agni.
That's right. Anyways, and but that was one of my, I think, first memories of seeing you live in person was that reading with Valeria.
And then it kind of grew from there, and it's one of the things that is I don't know, what I love so much about books and reading is there is no way to like slice the pie that's going to be empty of filling. Like if you focus your life on reading translated books, you are going to find amazing books for the rest of your life. If you don't, like if like for whatever reason you're just want to read American dudes, like you'll still never run out of great books. There might be reasons why I would argue branching out from that particular slice of pie, but you're still not going to run out of good books.
Yeah.
And so you pick up another Open Letter or Coffee House or Grey Wolf or Sandorf Passage or all these, or Biblioasis, or all these other incredible books that do a lot from publishers that do incredible translation. You keep finding good stuff. And then the other cool thing is when you kind of choose a focus like that is you end up in a community.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You get to know people like Spencer. You get to know, I think James is on here. I think you said James Crossley.
Justin Wall, my best friends. Hello, Justin.
Chad Post, Emma Ramadan, who is a translator as well, who has done some really fantastic work, who I've met a couple times because she's been to events. And you find community as well.
Yeah. Do you think, this is a question everyone always asks, do you think it's harder to sell a work of translation than it is your standard, like, literary fiction? Part of that comes from, there's a lot kind of working against translated literature in that, publishers consider a genre all of its own, which is kind of wrapped up in how those books are acquired. There is some, I think, consternation or like fear over, well, how do I market this? When it's like, well, it's just fiction. Like, and it's better, it's better fiction sometimes, not always, but yeah, would you say it's on a human to like person to person level, is it more difficult to sell those works?
I would say for me, no, because I'm familiar with it and I have built up this institutional knowledge of how to converse with people about books.
Yeah.
And I would say that one of the kind of the weird things about publishing and how publishing works and how they design publicity and how they design marketing and like all of this other stuff is that you can sell any good book. Like there's no type of book that is always going to be more difficult to sell if it is connected with booksellers who know how to sell that type of book. Yeah. I don't sell romance books really well, not because there's anything wrong with them, but just that's just not what my experience is.
On a lot of what your colleagues have read, like, exactly. I don't know, but I know that so-and-so has read it, and that's not as much of an endorsement as I have read it personally, and I can, guarantee your satisfaction. Yeah.
And I think the idea of that any particular type of literature is more difficult to sell, whether it's works in translation, works by people of color, works by kind of any marginalized population. Publishers will always say, "Oh, we would publish more, but like they just don't sell." And the problem is that's not those books' faults. That's not those authors' faults. That is your job. And what is great if you're a publisher is you have all of these allies who want to do nothing more than sell your books. And so I think it's one of those ideas that helps people in power not change.
Yeah.
And then there are some stats that they can point at that are relevant, but I think more coincident than cause. Like maybe the reason why not many people read translated literature in America, at least according to some scary sounding stats, is that you don't put in the work to sell it to them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's like, we pick winners and losers in this industry, especially, we do. Especially at the level of the corporate publisher who, this isn't a judgment, but they certainly have, the money speaks. You have a greater number of resources, entire teams of salespeople all over the country who, if, Penguin Random House wants to make, Benjamin Labatou a superstar because there's been an inkling of increased interest since, when we cease to understand the world, they can do that. And they have the ability to do that. And they have, I'm close with our Penguin sales rep here, and he, talks about how at Powell's, he was able to get them to double their order by by convincing them that that was, that was going to be the book. And by doing so, that guarantees, placement on the front stand, even if there's just one bookseller in that massive institution, Powell's, who, might have a staff pick for that book, that is guaranteeing prominent placement. It's the idea of like, you can walk into any bookstore in America right now and you see Zadie Smith's The Fraud. Sales may not, sales may or may not, beget, the amount of publicity that book has gotten, but at the very least, like, you see placement, and that's because of the work of people in sales, people in marketing, and some people who are like so far divorced from the editorial process or the contents of the book, like their concern is only externalities. And that's absolutely true on the corporate level. When you're working with indie publishers, like Open Letter, like you have, 3 people working for that publisher, and they are them and probably, I would say Lee Solomon, who's on this call, who's our consortium rep, I know in the Northwest, like she is solely responsible for, getting, half of all indie presses into bookstores, because she works with so many different, distributor publishers as part of consortium. So yeah, it's, it's a lot of it feels very predetermined. And so then, the selling of translation ends up kind of, or the lack thereof of sales is a predetermined self-made prophecy. I had a question. About also, we'll get started with audience questions here in about 1 minute. You have an online persona, which has recently transitioned from X, nay Twitter, or to Blue Sky, which is kind of like a Twitter replicant platform as of late. So whether it's, I was just curious, like whether it's Blue Sky or it's Instagram, like how do you choose about what books to talk about online?
And this, so I mentioned that idea about being an advocate. This also ties in a little bit to the idea of progressive book selling, which I talk about in another essay. And when I'm thinking about when I want to elevate a book, when I want to, for whatever reason, I always ask kind of 2 questions. Is this a for kind of in-person conversations, is this going to be a good book for this reader? But also, is it a book that has positive impacts on the world and on publishing? And when you have a platform, you have a responsibility as well, to use it in ways that uphold, at the very least, your own values. And so, so at this point, have been reading as a bookseller so long that I basically can pretty much guarantee that any book that I'm going to read for any amount of time is probably going to fit into that. It's either going to, elevate marginalized voice. It's going to be a small press. It's going to do something else that on top of being a fantastic book that I think people should read, it's also going to have, if people buy it, it will have those positive impacts. Probably the other kind of deciding factor is whether I can find a good way to talk about it. And this is another thing that I have gotten better at over time. There was, so for example, I did a TikTok video recommending a book called The Sea View Has Me Again, and I forget the author's name, but it is a gigantic biography of the East German expatriate writer Uwe Johnson, who wrote himself a massive book called Anniversaries. But most of the book is a history of this like shitty island in Britain. And it's incredible. And so what I did was I made a TikTok basically coming up with terrible reasons to read it, and had my compatriot be like very frustrated with me. Like I think one of my favorite lines was, it's like a 700-page tourism pamphlet that fails to convince you to visit the town. And so, there are lots of books I read and love that I choose not to platform just because they don't need my help. They're by best-selling authors. They're about things that are already of interest. They're by a big 5 publisher who, as you said, have teams of people who can decide to make book sales. And then the other thing is maybe there are some great books. I just can't quite figure out the right phrasing for the platform. And then those are always frustrating. I'm like I said, I've been doing this for as Spencer has reminded you all a couple of times, I have been doing this for almost 20 years. And so I'm better at finding those hooks, because, I also want that interaction to be interesting in and of itself. Like, I want you to buy the book. I want you to have a good experience with the book, but like, I also want you to have, even if it's just reading a tweet or watching a video or in-person conversation, I want that to also be positive and interesting and fun and hopefully also insightful, but if not, just like worth your time.
Yeah, no, that's great. We will get to audience questions now. Our first question comes from James Crosley, who's, we shouted him out a little earlier. He's the manager of Madison Books here in Seattle, a wonderful bookstore I go visit every time I'm in the neighborhood. And he says, hey, you're a new dad. He doesn't say, hey, it's not that aggressive, but you're a new dad. What were the first books that you hand sold to your kid?
Yes, I am. It's funny. This is both kind of good and bad. So we did the whole baby shower thing, and we got almost no books, which makes sense because, like, why would you buy me books? But we didn't get no books, and so we ended up with this like weird arrangement of like, books from people who maybe aren't quite as experienced as others are at picking out books for people. And so it's an odd array. We did get Goodnight Moon, which I think is, it's an old classic, but I love it. Goodnight Nothing might be one of the great lines of American literature. But I can tell you the first book that he really loved. And that was a book called Hello World. It's one of those high contrast books. So it's like bright colors and no text because it's kind of before they're reading. And I use that to make a staff pick. He's really enjoying Barnyard Dance, which again, another absolute classic of children's literature by Sandra Boynton. Also someone who does not need my help. She is in and of herself an industry. And what I'm kind of the bookseller angle that I'm most looking forward to when I get back, now being an actual father, is kind of one really getting to really lean into the weird dad. But on the kind of, I've also been recommending children's books for that long. I'm not quite as good at it because I don't know the industry, that side of publishing quite as well. But I have books that I love and books that I think people should read. And before, if someone said, well, what do your kids think about it? That was awkward. And now I can say, well, he's not old enough yet, or like, well, my kid did this and stuff. So I've had my community
have kids, you'll hook them immediately. Then you have something to talk about. That's not the sale, and all they want to do is talk about their own kids.
A part of me thinks I should just like put them in one of those, carriers and just like at the store and just like, you wouldn't say no. Like, obviously you'd say no to this face, but would you really say no to this face? Look at his cheeks. Would you really say no?
It's the ultimate guilt tactic. It's like me whenever, I always feel I'm very easy to make guilty. It doesn't even take a baby. I just have to walk into a store where I'm the only customer and the clerk is the only person at the desk, and it's like, shoot. And by then it's too late. Like, I have to buy something. I don't care if it's like the $12 like little pot or something. Like, I have to buy something though. Bill Brecht has a question. He asks, what is your opinion on the book publisher monopoly suing Internet Archive over DRM practices long used, so digital rights management practices? I'm also very curious about your answer here.
So that's, I think, two separate questions in a way that really did come together over Internet Archive. One is fair use and copyright, and one is DRM. And I'm going to start with DRM because I just know about that a little bit more. I have advocated for a long time that one of the biggest assets in terms of Amazon's monopoly of ebooks was actually DRM. Because the thing about it is the DRM software only keeps law-abiding citizens from transferring their libraries. And so what you have, so it doesn't prevent piracy in any meaningful way. And so, but what it does prevent is people from changing platforms. And so if publishers got rid of DRM, well, that would either force Amazon to put it on themselves, which would be, I'm sure they would try, it would be a very weird thing, or it would create the opportunity for people who have always been Kindle readers to actually exercise some choice and move their library, which they would then own, to a new platform if they chose. Because the thing about DRM is that it creates a situation where you actually don't own your digital library. You rent it. You paid a one-time rental fee, but it is locked into a particular device. They can take it away from you, and it limits your ability to be an active consumer. And so if there are any publishers listening to me, and we might have missed this opportunity, but if there is one thing that I think you can do that would help break Amazon's grasp, at least on ebooks, is to stop using DRM. Internet Archive is a challenging issue. I think a couple of different things about it, and I'm not an expert on copyright. I think they had good intentions, for sure. I think that was clear. But I also think that writers need to eat, and they need to get money to live and eat. And so there are tons of resources out there for people to find free books who can't afford them. There's the library. Digitally, there's Project Gutenberg, which has essentially every public domain book in existence. So you'll never be short of books. So I think there is a way that we can thread that needle, where we can find ways to make books, even new books, as accessible as Internet Archive was trying to do. Yeah. But I think if you do that without finding ways to make sure that the people who write books can live off that writing, then you're just kind of stealing from one to feed another.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the conversation is, Internet Archive continues to appear in the news as writers have opinions, they express them on, via Twitter, etc. But it's funny how that conversation is kind of rapidly shifted away from the Internet Archive, as now, the new boogeyman, of course, is artificial intelligence in writing, which we have absolutely no time to get into now. Yeah. Sorry to drop that bomb. But that is almost all the time we have here. But before we go, I had one more question, Josh. I was hoping you'd be able to give a rapid fire recommendation for a book about the book industry that you love. I love books about the book industry. Yeah. I love, the snake eating its own tail, like me just being kind of self-absorbed. But yeah. I'm curious if you have any that you think that, everyone should read.
Yeah. I loved The Haunted Bookshop by Christopher Morley.
Yeah. Great essay about in the collection as well.
Which is, and there's and what I love about it is there's a way to be romantic about something without kind of fetishizing it or idealizing it. And especially an industry that is vulnerable to vocational law, which Spencer was talking about a little bit earlier, where you kind of get people to give you free labor by talking about how special they are. I think Morley does a great job of getting the romantic parts of it without fetishizing the romantic parts of it. And I really love that. There's a scene where the character turns on a light display as a way to recommend a book to a customer. It's just the hit the lights hand sell. This is incredible. And it's still relevant. Characters still discuss whether or not booksellers should influence purchases, which is in some ways the existential debate that we have been having over the last few years. And we've tangled it with our own political context about First Amendment rights and white supremacy, but it's still the idea of whether we should have an influence over what people buy. I think we all know what I think. There are plenty of people who think differently. But I think, it's just such a heartwarming love letter. And I have started reading Danny Kane's, we referenced him earlier, How to Protect Bookstores and Why. And this is another book where I think it by focusing, it looks outward. And so he tells the story of a number of bookstores, Birchbark, which is Louise Erdrich's bookstore, Avid Bookstore in Athens, Georgia, a bunch of other places. And what you see are there's this kind of shadow of structural challenges. I just finished the passage on Avid Bookshop, and there's Janet had a great pitch, great locate, like everything said this bookstore would be successful, but she couldn't get a loan because she had never gotten a loan before. They'll never gotten a small business loan before. And it's like, well, how do we have a system that is supposed to work like that?
Yeah.
And so I'm not finished yet with it yet, but he does a really good job of telling stories, the ones that telling these stories in a way that you can see how they impact book selling and kind of learn from that in a way to think about book selling. But I think they also let us think about banking and capitalism and all of these other challenges that I mentioned kind of earlier, that these kind of challenges to life that also happen to have, maybe they're not challenging to your life, but they're challenging to your bookstore's life. And so they're worth thinking about and working to solve.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for your time today. This has been such a wonderful conversation. For anyone who, if you missed anything or you're looking for, you missed a title mentioned earlier in the conversation, we are going to post this online. I may even go through the entire thing and just list out every single book mentioned because I'm obsessive like that. I would love for, join the conversation at a later date. I hope to see all of you at Winter Institute one day. Other than that, please go out there, be well, go patronize your local bookstore.
Thank you all so much.